Hello, it's really nice to have been invited to speak at the conference. I think it's been really wonderful. I'm grateful to Juliet for asking me to do this. I know she's been very supportive of me in the past and my journey, and I hope that you won't be put off by the title. Obviously, if you're signing in, you haven't been. But I would call myself the reluctant home educator, which I'll explain a bit later. I don't want to go into too many personal details about our journey, but I think our journey is part of what I do and why I do it. So I'm the co-founder of Not Fine in School, which is an organisation. So we are a parent carer-led organisation. We support families of children who struggle with school attendance, which quite often is referred to as school refusal. We try to not use that phrase because refusal kind of seems to show a choice, and a lot of these children can't attend rather than just won't attend. And obviously what we found is that many of these children, the majority of them actually, I'll show you some of the figures in a little while, struggle because of special educational needs and disabilities, even whether they're suspected or actually diagnosed already, and such things as bullying. Children with special educational needs, whatever the environment they're in, can appear different to children and may not have the skills to deal with some kinds of social situations, and therefore those children can be more prone to bullying. So obviously there's a lot of overlap in a lot of these areas, and not just special educational needs, but physical and mental health. A lot of children struggle with school attendance. I'm not going to speak only about school attendance, but at Not Fine in School, we are there to support families to help them be able to access education, not necessarily school, but those that come to us have usually tried school or some kind of formal learning environment and haven't coped with it. And obviously, all of these are compounded by something that I think has led to the huge rise in home education. I don't just think it, I see it on a regular basis, but due to the challenges within the education system, the academisation of schools and that kind of thing, where there are schools not necessarily following rules that they should be following and guidelines and doing their own thing really, plus the curriculum changing, so all of those things. So we just want to support those families because, as you can imagine, it's those of you who may have been through this situation, it's a horrendous situation. It's something I never even knew existed, and when I went through it with my middle son, I felt like I was made to feel actually by professionals that I was the only person who'd ever experienced this situation. Nobody used the term even school refusal to me. I only found it by Googling what happens when your children can't go to school, and it was very, very extreme, and there was a lot of distress for the whole family. So that's what we try to do, and I think you can't beat lived experience as helping with the need to support. Probably like many of you just share your experiences, don't you? And you share your part of your journey to try to help people to navigate their journey if they're at a different stage probably than you. So that's what Not Fine in School is. And we do provide supports through, I suppose we give information and suggestions and support generally, but we've got over 11,800 members of a support group on Facebook. It's a closed, private Facebook group. And we also signpost, and we do some kind of, I'd say, campaigning, trying to raise awareness, because it is a real problem, children who have school refused or are school refusing, and it affects them, as you'll see a bit later on when I discuss it, some of our situation, but it actually affects the way you learn going forward as well, and attitudes towards learning and ability to learn and all of those things. And obviously, had I known about home education earlier, would I have opted to home educate? I don't know. I kept within the system as long as I could, and fought and fought and fought. But I'll talk about some of those issues as well and see if there's ways that we can find support for those who struggle. For me, I call myself the home, I don't call myself this, I never have, but I thought of this as a talk, was that I was not, home education wasn't something that I chose. It wasn't something that I planned. It was something that was my last resort, and it's something that I've had to do. And I've learned so much, and I appreciate it so much that I think later on in one of my slides, I say that even on a bad day, even on a day when I feel like it's not working out for us, it's still better than school. And obviously long before you get to that point, it's important to consider home education, isn't it? We don't, within our group, home education is one of the options that we explain to families. But it's a big decision, isn't it? And especially when we're talking about children with mental health problems and special educational needs, it's how do we do the right thing for them? But for us, we just want to help, but we also want probably what's something that seems quite difficult at the moment, which is to promote children's well-being and happiness. And that for us is the most important thing, that they have access to education. And unfortunately for many people that seems to be school. And although having said that, what we're called Not Fine in School, which when we thought of the title and we were organising the group a couple of years ago, we were saying, what would we call this? And Not Fine in School sounds negative, but actually these are children we want to be, like I say, fine and be well. That's what we want for them. But actually, our parents that we support, and in my experience too, many of the professionals that you meet will refer to the children as being fine in school. And parents know they're not, because parents are the experts, aren't they, in all situations, really. They know their own children. And it is so frustrating, and it's increasing. So I was a teacher years and years ago, in the dim and distant past, when child education system was more child-led. A parent would come to me and say that they'd noticed a child had got difficulties, and that would be a discussion, look for solutions, find out what those difficulties are, or I would notice them. I think that's a big difference, is the lack of noticing of difficulties for children and the insistence that they're fine, because when you admit they're not fine, something has to be done about it. And so how can you ensure that children get a good education unless you can acknowledge how they actually are? I sat in a child protection conference that we had a rogue head teacher for one of my children who did not like any form of suggestion or complaint that things weren't right when things got to it. And so we were referred to social services, and we sat in a child protection conference that was called because my children were not accessing education, i.e. they weren't going to school for various reasons. One has a medical health condition, the other was what you would call a school refuser, didn't cope with the transition to high school. And my youngest, the head teacher denied that there were any special needs and refused to accept diagnoses from NHS professionals, which is quite shocking. So that meant we ended up in a child protection conference where both of the schools of my middle and my youngest son described my children as being fine in school. Luckily, I am able to represent myself and discuss that, and I will mention some of these phrases, but I asked them to define fine. Thankfully I've got ADHD, so I do get away with some things sometimes, so I wasn't really meant to speak, and I did blurt it out on time to time, go, oh no, that's not quite right, oh, can I just ask a question? And one of them I did say, well, could you just define fine? When you defined fine, it really wasn't fine. A child saying to a social worker, I'm frightened of school, I get hurt at school, the children hurt me, I've got bruises on my legs and on my arms, they are my friends but they hurt me, I feel poorly every day, Another one, the school had to admit that he falls asleep at his desk, which, well, you know, a 12, 13-year-old child shouldn't really be falling asleep at their desk, that he doesn't cope well with change, and that he fidgets and is anxious and ill a lot of the time. That's how you define fine in their eyes. So it's important, whoever we meet on our journeys with our children, is that we have this definition of fine. On a funny note, when I described this, I couldn't deregister at this point. I had to stay on roll. I had to be fighting within the system as we'd got this child protection thing going on. I waited till that was over and done and dusted. We didn't come out on child protection because the conference chair was brilliant. And we were describing what we do with our children. And one of them was forest school. So we'd been attending a local forest school, and the chair actually interrupted me and said, "Forest school? How amazing does that sound? Who wouldn't want their child to go to a forest school? Which children wouldn't want to go?" And she really turned it on its head as me being the person who was being abusive. I have had confirmation unofficially that one of my children was abused within school by the head teacher, that it was neglect. For obviously, if you were a parent and you said, "Oh, I don't think my child is ill, you know," and a consultant rheumatologist says they are, you would be in trouble, wouldn't you? So a lot of harm was caused by that. So what we did when we started this group was we devised a simple survey. We wanted to know why our parents were struggling and what they were struggling with at school, and why their children were not fine. And we were quite small in those days. We only had about 1,600 or 700, and I think just about everybody on the Facebook group, which if you've ever done a survey, that's a pretty good reach of people. It's only a small amount really, but it was quite significant because 92% of the parents felt that the school attendance problems were related to special educational needs, unsupported and unrecognised. 64.1%, it says there, doesn't it, reported that they've got a diagnosis. And then others were saying, 26.6% were saying they suspected that. And with that, we got these implications, which for those of you who have only home educated and that's your choice, and you've noticed, you know, or you've been home educated for a long time, you've seen this rise in home education, and obviously there's lots of puzzled people in authority who go, "Why, that's all happening," including certain quite well-known officials. But also, I was invited, because of Not So Fine in School and because of the mess they made of my case, I got to know the inclusion team and children's services and education department at the local authority, and they asked me to be on a committee to talk about the rise of home education. It was quite funny. They asked me to design a survey. And I did say, I don't really think we need to do one, because I think we really know why there's a rise of home education within our county. It was quite funny because they did do the survey, and I never got the results of it. So I had to do a freedom of information request, even though I'd been part of the committee that wrote the thingy. I said, "Oh, can you share them with me?" And they said, "No, we can't share them with you because you don't work for us." So, and obviously it confirmed all of this. It confirmed what you know, what I know, what we all know really, probably. And that, so you imagine you're in this position, your children, you've got them on roller to school, and then you're threatened with a fine. So you've got a child who's distressed, with special educational needs, not being supported, mental health declining, your own mental health declining, people within the family, the whole family is turned upside down, seeing that level of distress. You know, when you have a child trying to jump out of a car, trying to, I don't know, climbing up a tree, hiding in various places, it's horrendous for the whole family. And obviously, you love your family and all the siblings are also affected. So on top of that, you get threatened with prosecution. Thankfully, only 1.3% actually went to prosecution. But it's that threat, you know. And then we had this really surprised us. Even me, having been through the child protection, I was surprised that a quarter of our parents are referred to social services because their children aren't able to attend school. And then 18.4%, that is a huge amount of FII, which formerly known as Munchausen by proxy. That's a huge amount of people for a relatively rare, almost some professionals say is not actually a diagnosis that you can give, that it doesn't actually exist in that form. So imagine that. Whilst you're in this position, you know, what can you do? It's really hard to know what to do. And like I say, it was very difficult at that point for me to do anything other than, by this stage I was with social services, I was in a stronger position to be able to argue for my children. And they weren't forced into school, so eventually. So the results show, you know, that it's poor parenting is the attitude towards why these children can't attend school. Which is quite interesting, because it's the parents who are generally asking for more support and are well aware of their children's problems, but you get sent on these funny little parenting courses, which of course you have to go on to show willing, otherwise you're not cooperating. This is the saddest part. Some of you, it just makes me want to cry, really, to think that most, you know, almost half have been encouraged or made to force their children into school, whilst being under social services on a child in need plan. For a while I had to go along with a head teacher manhandling my son off of me to drag him into school. Does anyone think it's helpful? No, it didn't help anybody. And these aren't professional led, these are people with opinions that they think that's right for your child. So I developed a framework where you can ask this, and I think it's useful not just for those children in school, for when you come across professionals, medical professionals, anyone who doesn't understand the way that your child learns, the way that your child struggles, they will have their opinions. They're 9 times out of 10, I would say, although I haven't done a survey for that they are not based on profession. They're not based on actual evidence. I've not yet come across fully qualified consultant psychiatrist recommending that children are physically carried into school away from their mums screaming and crying. You know, I've not seen that. So you get, obviously, I think that's the worry now, and why we are so grateful for home education, that we can escape from this situation where people who don't know our children and don't necessarily have the right experience or knowledge or qualifications are telling us what we need to do with our children, and it's quite frightening, isn't it? So, you know, people you can challenge people. What's your working definition of fine? Which is one thing I did. You know, if you gathered all the evidence, you considered their difficulties, the impact of SEND. Anyone who goes to child protection for school attendance or any of those kind of difficulties should already be social services. It's in their framework that they should be assessing for special educational needs. Is there a reason? Most professionals should know about masking. Some children look fine, don't they? But they're actually, my son would just be frozen in fear. And then I've got my son, who his way of coping is to avoid, because he knows he can't do it. And that has a big impact, doesn't it? So these children are not only are they less likely to attend school regularly, but the long-term effects, had I known them what I know now, for example, the trauma, a lot of children are leaving school now and they are arriving in the home education world with trauma. They are traumatized, or they are still within that school situation, and obviously they're then deteriorating. So I'll leave that. You know, we don't need to talk loads about that because I want to get onto the home education side of things as well, obviously. But we've produced 2 guides. More than that, we've produced a few guides. The Not Fine, the Define Fine guide we've produced as a leaflet, but on our website, and we print these out and send them out to families if they need them. My child is struggling in school, what can I do? And a child is struggling to come to school. So one side is for professionals, and you can go into a meeting and use it as a checklist. And it's not just for schools, it's for social workers, for anyone, any professional. I found it really useful going into schools to support parents in meetings and, you know, just going down the criteria. Have they been assessed for SEND? Have they been referred for support? Now, I thought I would discuss this because we were really, really, really disappointed. I was personally, obviously, very disappointed about the home education programme, skipping school on dispatches. And then Longfield went to say that the right of a parent to remove their child from school can no longer come before the best interests and the rights of their child, which is fair enough that she thinks that. But, you know, parents, as you all know, parents have the duty in law to choose the education that they believe is more suitable. And it might be fulfilled within school or it might not. And so without the option to remove our children from this harmful situation, how can we fulfill our duties? She, as some of you may know, she met my son who's traumatised. She traumatised him in my own home to make complaints about that because he has got trauma from the way he was treated by a head teacher, and she speaks like a head teacher. So obviously she was quite triggering for him and he didn't want to speak with her. And she glossed over the fact that my son was harmed within a mainstream local authority maintained school. So we believe that home education, and we do promote this, that home education protects children, and it's not the problem. And the problems are, as many know, the lack of funding for SEND, for CAMS, the bullying, the academisation, rigid curriculum, not flexibility. It seems to be all or nothing. My children in particular, I feel, are trapped in a little no man's land between mainstream school and specialist school. They don't really fit either category because it's not flexible enough. But also, as I say, I'm a home educator. It's been quite a journey home educating, and sometimes I've felt trapped between home education and school. So I've been in this no man's land with my children for a long time. But the biggest, for me, one of the biggest, is the lack of accountability. That it's nigh on impossible to make complaints about schools. It's nigh on impossible to make complaints about they investigate themselves. So you're in a tricky situation, but we're adamant at not finding school, you know, that home education is not the problem. We did a survey, which I won't read the whole thing because obviously there's a lot of it, but they're on my slides, so they, you know, please feel free to share them. And the whole report, this is a summary. There's a whole report, and it makes quite interesting reading. The Children's Commissioner has had a copy of it, and a reminder that she's had a copy of it a number of times. But, you know, we're talking about whether they felt forced to home educate. 233 children, I can't remember how many. Somewhere I've got how many people answered this, but out of that figure, you know, it wasn't really a choice, was it? You know, if your child's mental health and health is deteriorating, they found that schools were difficult to work with. So, I mean, I've had it mentioned to me, which I know is illegal. Oh, you thought about home educating? Or one actually kept saying repeatedly, you know, Louise, we don't mind if you choose to home educate your son. And I'd never mentioned it. So I was saying, oh, no. I've had a head teacher say to me in a not very nice way, I've got 1,800 children on my school roll. Why do I need to accommodate your son and his needs? I did say, because you're actually paid to, and it's your statutory duty. And he said, well, I like to think of myself as a grammar school. This is why I don't get along very well sometimes, because I can't help myself. But, you know, I said, well, you know, you can think of yourself as a grammar school. You're funded as a comprehensive school, and you have to accommodate the children on your school roll, and I'm not taking him off your school roll. So my middle son chose to stay on the school roll, but he's had education other than at school. So when you think about this, you know, a lot of these parents have then chosen this home education because of the learning environment. My local authority have just had a really, really scathing report from Ofsted and CQC, that complete Ascend inspection that completely backs all of this up. And that's come from Ofsted, and we don't like Ofsted, do we really? So for them to have come out and said that these parents and children have been let down, that they've been left fighting for services and defending themselves against services, is pretty damning. I think it would be very hard, hopefully, for them in the future if they're a good local authority for home education, but they have no grounds really to be accusing parents, do they, when they've got this formal report that's come out. So, you know, some parents actively chose it, obviously not all forced to do it, and they realised that the learning environment wasn't working, and that they've opted to do it because it was the right thing for their child. Oh, here we go. I should have started with this one. It was 473 parents. So this was during the period immediately following the dispatches programme. You know, and why they deregistered, how many had been off-rolled and that kind of thing. The fact that the Children's Commission wasn't horrified by the facts, even in her own report, is a bit frightening, but there we are. So it goes along really with some of our other things. I'll see what we can look at that probably later at your own leisure, and there's more information. Like I said, it's a whole full report, and it's got people's comments and how they feel and everything. So here I am, home educating the reluctant learner. Hang on, that's not right. Oh, here we go, I'll go back a bit. Reluctant homeschoolers, that's what I've called it, homeschooler. I know it's home education, but at the time, why did I write homeschooling? I'm the home educator. Sorry about that, that's an error. But I want to know what does this mean? And what I mean by reluctant home education, which I will edit that because that's not right, is home education when it was a last resort. And how do you home educate struggling, potentially traumatised children? This was my problem, is once I decided to home educate, I got really excited and I set up this gorgeous classroom with all the different areas and books everywhere. Bearing in mind my children are dyslexic, but anyway, I got all excited about all these things we were going to do, and my youngest, who is home educated, was having none of it, which I'll talk about as well. How do we get over that difficulty? But how do we fit into a community that we didn't expect to join? I felt, and how does the home ed community generally cope with this influx of home educators, homeschoolers who are have got children with special educational needs? I find it quite heartbreaking that most of the meetups that I used to go to, autistic children and families at the end of their tether, absolutely struggling, were just arriving weekly. And like I say, you know, you've got, my son did go to Forest School, thankfully, while we were doing Child Protection Conference, but he couldn't cope even with that. He couldn't cope with attending groups regularly. He was physically and emotionally unwell, and he is diagnosed with school trauma now. So how do we even engage them, you know? And children who've been used to school, home education is very, very different to them. I know there's lots of people who deschool or use unschooling methods, but it's not just that, it's their expectations, and they've been used to a very different social life. We know that it's not natural to stick a load of 30 odd children in a room all the same age. We know that that's not natural, but for children who have got little friendship groups at school and they're used to seeing those children all day, every day, going to home education groups and not knowing who's going to be there the next week is quite difficult. So it's a difficult situation for everybody. And what I really want to say by saying that I'm a reluctant home educator, it doesn't mean that I don't appreciate it. I think how amazing home education is. And I'm so grateful to other home educating families who've gently led me along the way and showed me that there's another way. Like I say, I was a teacher, but I worked a much more child-friendly system, child-led. So how do we do it? So this is what we've done, and we've had to do it our way, and we've had to take it at our own pace, and adapt it to our days and how we feel. And actually, I've opted for 24/7, 365 a day learning, high days and holidays. You know, I know that I can take those days off. I know that we can learn anytime, any place, anywhere. Sounds like an advert for something, but you know, we can. So what could we do? We've had to do a lot of incidental learning. Even my son, who's traumatized and refuses to engage quite often, sometimes I'll say, you know what you do? Let's make a little cake. Oh, could you just read out the ingredients for me? And he will say, you're tricking me into learning, aren't you? And we have got to the point where we can't use the word learning. We couldn't use the word school anymore. Learning, kind of okay saying finding out. So now I call it let's find out about this. And so what I found, it's a bit of a trick, but my son couldn't sleep alone for 2 years because of the bullying and the trauma. So he's been quite difficult about bedtimes. So I would give him a choice. You know, I'd say, are you going to go to bed? Or, you know, would you like to do a bit of maths? Or would you like to have a look at this? And I will say that our bedtimes are less structured because our days are less structured. But if my son, actually his little bedroom's just over there, and he's got this times tables book at the moment that he actually loves manipulating all the numbers and working out. He's 11. If he's on a roll and relaxed and learning at, say, 9 o'clock at night, I can't just go, thank you, yeah, that's lovely, flick the light off, good night, off you go to sleep. And so we make the most of that. Had to focus on strengths and interests. A lot of children are struggling when they've got special educational needs, or for whatever reason they stop going to school. You know, what my middle son, who has dyslexia and ADHD, what he spent most of his time at school doing is the things he's rubbish at, the things that he struggles with the most. If you have a dyslexic child, it's quite often they will spend more time than any other child doing spelling, intervention, and those kind of things. And he then spent less time on the things he was good at. Quite interesting during the lockdown period, because obviously I've been following parents who are still on roll at school, and how that they are, you know, teaching their children at home, working with the schools and everything. Isn't it funny that the things the children are loving is the art and the music workshops and all of the active, you know, Joe Wicks and all that kind of thing, which I don't, but you know, I just think it's interesting that within schools, the areas you struggle in the most, you get more of, instead of going, why don't you do more maths? Why don't you do, for my middle son, gymnastics? He's a natural born gymnast. He's a natural born climber. You know, and those children who do flexi schooling due to, not technically flexi schooling, but on reduced timetables at school, which includes my children, they do English, maths and science. They don't do the PE, the art, the drama, the kind of things that they could excel in. They get cut down to the basics. So that's what made me think about these strengths and interests. I'm sure many of you, that's the way you do your learning activities anyway. But recently I've just been thinking, I don't know why recently, because this is how I've done it, but you know, why replicate school if it didn't work? Those of us who've been brainwashed, I don't know, lived in that only known that system, it's very easy to try to replicate it, isn't it? Personally, as when I was teaching, I don't think I ever used a worksheet for teaching, because I taught younger children, and it was all learning through play and active learning. it's not teaching through a worksheet or whatever, which is quite funny that a lot of the schools during lockdown are sending out all these worksheets. But there are some schools out there who are doing it quite well, you know, and emphasising well-being and family time and practical activities and those kind of things. So why replicate school if it didn't work? And that goes to the curriculum, doesn't it? You know, who says English, maths, science, history, geography, blah, 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 all the subjects to learn. And like I say, you can do it anytime, any place, anywhere. So when we talk about the environment, we've got the perfect opportunity to set up that environment that's going to work for our special needs children. Or I was talking actually to the Senko at my middle son's school, and I said, you know what, having been through, by the way, I've been through years and years of fighting for an EHCP, for the kind of provision. How many years of my life I've wasted in meetings saying, oh, we need to do this and can we try that and blah, blah, blah. Really, when not finding school, we do have a partner sort of organisation that do more campaigning. It's one of the mums that has experienced school refusal, and she's called Square Peg. So yes, my sons, this is where I say where we slip between mainstream and specialist school. My children are dyslexic. And one is diagnosed with ADHD, and the others, well, two of them are diagnosed with ADHD. I have ADHD. The possibility is that my youngest does, but I can't do too much about it at the moment in case they accuse me of fabricating induced ADHD. But those signs are there that he has ADHD, and that he has got an EdSite report because I applied for an assessment for him. So, you know, I just think it's very difficult, isn't it, to know about this. But it just made me think, what are they interested in? Now, my Juliet said that my surname is Engels, and that means English in Afrikaans and Dutch and various languages. So my son has cousins in Belgium. My husband is Flemish. I haven't seen Flemish on any curriculum at school, but it's relevant to our family. It's a language that we would like to speak with little cousins. So every day we are learning Dutch. And, you know, that works for us. Like I was saying about the ADHD, most of my son's English work, if you call it that, he wouldn't know that it's that, but we're sitting on a swing outside, looking at the sky, describing the sky. Two of my sons just have to move to learn. Children who've got ADHD, for example, it's quite a misconception. Obviously, a lot of you probably know, but a lot of people think it's about bad behaviour, where of course it's actually a neurological condition. And a lot of children who move, they actually can't learn unless they're moving, similar to lots of the children with autism, and they're stimming. If they're not doing that, all my son did for probably a year of school and high school, not that he was there for much of it, was spent gripping himself, trying to contain it so that he didn't fidget. Whereas if he'd actually been on, which I asked for over and over, maybe like an office chair that he could spin on occasionally, he would have learned so much more, but he spent most of his energy and time, which is really detrimental to our children's health as well. So going along with the incidental learning and the strengths and weaknesses and doing it our way, we also need to look for suitable therapy, perhaps. I don't know. That's something we've been doing with my youngest, but actually he's been doing some Big Life Journal. He gets a choice between Big Life Journal and maths. And although maths is better than bedtime, Big Life Journal is better than maths. And so he now can get out his Big Life Journal and fill it in himself and read it to himself and talk to me about it. For those who are finding themselves in my sort of situation, I think it is important to find or form, when you can, a welcoming group, but that might not happen. And it doesn't matter if you can't, but you have to find a way that works for you. It might be that your children want to attend the kind of activities that school children attend, but they do it, you know, weekends and evenings or whatever, even if it's one friend, one person. But I definitely think it's worth looking for, and I think that's something that Chu do really, really well, is the mentoring support, finding someone who's walked that path before. For me, I had a friend in the early days who just showed me how she naturally teaches her children through a mixture of, you might think it's a slightly formal approach, but it was just natural, the way that her children heard stories and learned to read and write. And obviously it's about going back to what you believe and what you really feel, and it's your gut feeling, isn't it? You know that something's right and something's not right. And so I think that's the other thing, you know, it might be one other person. For me, I've had most of my support hasn't come from home education community. We couldn't cope with the dynamics of the home education groups, and then we were locally, we haven't yet found one, but we haven't given up. But I felt it was very important when I arrived at the group that I offered what I could share. I'd come from running the PTA, so I was quite keen to get involved. And so, but you can only do that when you're ready. And when I look back now, the trauma that my son was going through I must have some kind of trauma from that too. So I wasn't really ready probably for groups, but I think he wasn't ready. He was quite avoidant of that. And like I say, he wasn't very well. And I think it's important as well just to celebrate those small successes. During lockdown, there's no expectation for my son to go and join in any groups. He is thriving. A lot of the not finding school children are on a roll. They are relaxed. Like I said, we know it's not natural for children to be in a room full of 30 children, especially for my son who, although school denied there was anything wrong with him, he was apparently on the bottom table. So he was with a lot of other children who had difficulties with learning, which is horrendous. I didn't realise that at the time. Things come out gradually over time. My son likes that he can go to the toilet. He said randomly the other day, what I like about home education is I can go to the toilet when I need to. And I was horrified. He'd actually got a gastro problem. He'd got a bowel blockage while he was at school that school knew about. Even for him, he wasn't allowed to go to the, and obviously, of course, we're home educating and he's absolutely healthy and well. He's so well. I think it's fine as well. Home education doesn't have to be forever. It's something to try and see how it works. And also people in my situation, I do, you know, children who are home educating, who have special educational needs, also have provision. Their needs are also covered within the SEND Code of Practice. So you still are entitled to ask for help and support. Medical assessments, special educational needs assessments, you can still apply for an education healthcare plan. They can still be seen by an ed psych if necessary, which my son was at home. And obviously some parents just feel they need that extra bit of support that they perhaps can't provide and would like to consider education other than at school packages. So now my son, who spent all these years trying to fit in with school, I've got an educational package that includes mainly climbing. He wants to be a professional climber and he's going to be climbing. So, you know, celebrate the small successes, I would say, and find their strengths and interests, and we have to build them up anyway. For me, home education is anything we do at home is educational. These 30 children, particularly the ones that my son sat at the table, I was thinking he might need speech and language therapy. Actually, he just needed to be able to speak and have good conversation modelled and join in with. And his language is common. And I've got a little success story to just share before I finish and see if there are any questions. Sorry, I do talk a lot. But this last week, my son has played on the computer more than I would like. But he absolutely loves this game that he plays. And I was listening in on him, which is why I've extended some of his computer time this week. He was asked to be a moderator on his game that he plays, a Roblox Minecrafty type game. His role was to look out for children He'd noticed children were being bullied. He's learnt to not use the phrase bullying for every type of unkindness that he comes across. But he was informing the owner of this little, you know, it's a teenager who's got this online, whatever you call it, server, and he offered to help. And he was going through the game, noticing who was being picked on, who was being harassed. And he was interrupting their game and saying, excuse me, do you need any help? You could report this to them. And then he was reporting them or giving them warnings. And I've never seen him thrive and be so happy. So every night at bedtime, he was beaming. It was about 3 days he was doing it. Then yesterday at bedtime, I just thought, oh gosh, what if something awful happens within the game? Because obviously it's anything could happen. He said to me, I'm not moderating anymore. And I was waiting for the drop. And he said, you know, I've got better things to do with my time than moderate a game. So I've resigned from my moderating difficulties, my duties. I will still support people, but I've got other things to do. I'm just a little boy, I'm only 11, and I need to play in the garden, I need to do this, I need to do that, and I can't be doing that. So that's what I mean by celebrate the successes. That's taken 2 years to get to that point. Where we go from here, I don't know, but I'm just so happy. And I'm so glad that I listened to the home educators who have experienced and said, just trust that it will be okay. And I you know, it will be. Having seen my other son go through, he's in the current cohort that he might come away with no GCSEs currently because there wasn't enough evidence, because he was educated at home with a tutor from the local authority, you know. And here I am, I run Not Fine in School. That's not what I'm trained to do. You know, that's not what I did, although it ties in with what I did. I'm doing SEND Law as a course. So learning carries on throughout all of our lives, doesn't it? We know that. It's just having the confidence to believe in it and to keep doing it. And that's really what I wanted to say. What are we going to do next if it's going to, you know, home education will continue to increase until there are some really big changes. And actually, I know some people have been worrying about home education. 5%, we did a recent survey which actually went to the government just before they announced that parents were going to have a choice whether to send their children back to school. We've really campaigned as Not Fine in School that should be a choice for parents without penalising. And thankfully, someone we work with managed to get that across to the government, and we were so chuffed when it was announced. They've seen the results of this survey. 5% of respondents said that they home educated before lockdown, but 23% of the people who answered the survey, and I can't remember, it'll say something like that, how many people it was, are considering home education now because they've seen their children thrive. And I think that's really exciting. So I'll turn over to you now for any questions. I'll try to stop.
Right, that's lovely. Thank you so much, Louise. We have actually run quite far over our allotted time, but Louise will be on the app, so please feel free to go onto her session, ask her any questions there. I know she has already answered there, she's been on there already. So
there's some burning questions that have come through already. There's some extra questions I haven't had.
There's none on the app that I can see. Okay. But I mean, we do normally finish at sort of a little bit before the next hour. So I suggest that if everybody does have anything they want to discuss with Louise, ask her. If you go onto the app, pop the questions there. And she has been really active on there at responding to them. But yes, thank you very much. It has been superb, and we'll move on to the next session shortly. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much.